Welcome to Fluent Daily, the English listening channel for advanced learners at B2 and C1 level. Every episode features a rich, flowing conversation in natural English on a topic that is genuinely worth thinking about: history, psychology, science, philosophy, and more. There are no simplified sentences here, no slow speech, no vocabulary drills. Just real English spoken naturally on ideas that matter. This is Fluent Daily. Let's get into it.
Today we have a great story, so let's get started right now.
There is this word that has basically infiltrated everything lately.
Oh, it really has.
Yeah, like your HR seminars, your self-help books, even your kids' school.
Everywhere you look.
And it is heavily marketed to you as a superpower.
Right.
It's sold as this individual character trait, something you either naturally possess or, honestly, that you shamefully lack.
Which is such a damaging way to frame it.
Exactly. Or maybe even worse, it's sold to you as this mental armor that you can just, install.
Like downloading a software update.
Right. A mandatory corporate training program that's supposedly going to make you totally invulnerable to the bad things in life.
Yeah, that framing of invulnerability is just incredibly seductive because it promises absolute control.
It really does.
It tells you that if you just do the right mental push-ups, if you just journal enough or meditate perfectly, nothing can ever truly hurt you.
Sounds great, right?
It sounds wonderful, but it is a fundamental misunderstanding of human biology and sociology.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because the core mission of today's deep dive is to actually look at the evidence.
Yes, the real data.
We are constantly bombarded with this demand to be, quote-unquote, resilient. But when you look at the rigorous science, almost everything we are told about bouncing back from adversity is completely unsupported by the data.
It really is.
We're going to explore how that popular understanding isn't just wrong, but it's actively harmful to people who are genuinely suffering.
Because true resilience is not about bouncing back to exactly who you were before the bad thing happened.
No.
And it's not this solitary lone wolf endeavor where you just grit your teeth and power through.
Like you're some action hero.
Exactly. What the research actually shows is that resilience is this highly complex, deeply social, and incredibly dynamic neurological phenomenon.
So our goal today is to dismantle those commercial myths that you've been sold. We want to rebuild your understanding of how human beings actually survive and adapt to adversity.
And we have decades of rigorous psychological, neurological, and cross-cultural research to help us do that.
And I can promise you this. By the end of this deep dive, you are going to view your own workplace, your local community, and the very wiring of your own brain in a completely different light.
It really flips the script on everything we've been taught.
It totally does. Let's start by looking at the actual language we use. Because the linguistic trap is really where this whole misunderstanding starts.
That's a great place to start.
The word resilience itself has a very specific origin. It actually comes from the Latin root resiliere, which literally means to spring back.
And understanding that physical origin is absolutely critical to seeing where we went wrong with this concept.
How so?
Well, it was originally a term used purely in material sciences and engineering.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, it described the physical property of a material, like a steel beam or a rubber band returning to its exact original form after being deformed, bent, or stretched.
Which is where I have to push back on how we use it for human beings today. Because, think about a piece of memory foam.
Okay, memory foam?
You squish a piece of memory foam down, right? You put a massive heavy weight on it.
Right.
And the second you remove that weight, it just springs right back. It looks exactly as it did before you applied the pressure.
It completely erases the impact.
Exactly. But human beings aren't pieces of foam.
We certainly are not.
When someone goes through a crushing experience, like a profound loss, a severe illness, a massive failure.
Right, real trauma.
Yeah. The idea that they should just spring back to their original shape, totally unchanged by that pressure, is intuitively appealing, but fundamentally flawed. We don't just erase our experiences.
We definitely do not. And what's fascinating here is how the most methodologically rigorous research in psychology actually tracks with your intuition there.
Really?
Yes. If we look at the work of George Bonanno at Columbia University, we see a completely different picture of what it means to survive adversity.
Okay. Tell me about Bonanno's work.
So Bonanno conducts longitudinal research, and that distinction is vital.
Meaning he tracks people over a long period of time.
Exactly. He doesn't just look at people once in a cross-sectional snapshot right after a tragedy. He follows them over years, specifically looking at their responses to profound loss and trauma.
And we actually touched on some of his findings in our previous explorations of bereavement.
Yes, we did.
The historical context of his work is wild to me because the prevailing psychiatric models before him were so incredibly rigid.
They really were.
For a long time, the clinical assumption, which was heavily influenced by early Freudian ideas about grief work, was that if you experienced a major trauma or profound loss, you basically had to go through a prolonged period of severe visible distress.
The clinical establishment assumed that profound, debilitating agony was the only healthy response.
Wow.
Yeah. If you didn't exhibit that, if you seemed to be doing relatively okay, keeping your job, maintaining your relationships.
Psychiatrists and therapists just assumed you were in pathological denial.
Exactly. They genuinely believed the absence of visible grief was a psychiatric failure.
That is so wild to think about now.
They thought you were suppressing the trauma, and that it would inevitably explode later as a severe neurosis or some sort of physical illness.
Like a ticking time bomb of unexpressed sadness that was just waiting to destroy your life.
That was literally the clinical consensus. But Bonanno's data completely shattered that myth.
How did you do that?
By tracking thousands of individuals over time, he found that the single most common response to major loss or trauma is actually the resilience trajectory.
The single most common response.
Yes.
I want to make sure you, listening right now, really internalize how radical this shift is. Because we have been conditioned by movies, by literature, by old school pop psychology.
By practically everything.
Yeah, to believe that being completely shattered by adversity is the default human setting.
Right.
We're taught that resilience is some rare, exceptional trait that only a few stoic heroes possess.
But Bonanno mathematically proved that resilience is common. It is the norm, not the exception.
That's incredible.
The data shows that you are fundamentally wired to survive intact. It is deeply reassuring when you look at the actual numbers.
So what does that resilience trajectory actually look like in his data?
A large percentage of people maintain relatively stable, healthy psychological and physical functioning in the face of highly disruptive events.
Meaning they don't just collapse.
Right. They feel pain, of course, they grieve. It's not that they don't care.
Sure.
But their baseline functioning, their ability to eat, sleep, work, and love, it doesn't collapse into clinical pathology.
But Bonanno's research also brings us to another critical finding, which is where the superpower myth really falls apart.
Yes.
Because he documents that resilience is not a fixed character trait. It's not a badge you earn and wear forever.
And that is the most persistent myth we need to dispel today. You don't just have resilience in your psychological bank account ready to withdraw for any problem you face. The research demonstrates that the exact same person might show incredible resilience in the face of a massive career setback. Say, getting fired from a job they tied their whole identity to.
They might just pivot, start a new business, and barely miss a beat.
Exactly. But that same person might completely crumble under a different type of stress.
Like what?
Like a sudden health crisis or navigating a complex divorce.
The popular narrative always says things like, oh, Sarah's such a resilient person.
Right.
As if Sarah is wearing a magical, invisible shield that deflects absolutely everything the universe throws at her.
But Sarah might be highly resilient to financial stress and simultaneously highly vulnerable to interpersonal conflict.
Which tells us that resilience isn't just about what's inside the person's head.
No, it is highly dependent on social and contextual features.
So it's about the environment.
The environment you are in, the resources you have access to at that specific moment, the nature of the threat itself, all of these external factors dictate your response.
And that's huge, because if it's just about you, then if you fail to be resilient, it's completely your fault.
You just didn't try hard enough.
Exactly. But if it's about the context, that completely changes the game. It removes the blame.
It does.
So if we accept that resilience isn't this fixed individual trait that you were just born with, like eye color, where does the capacity to handle stress actually come from?
That is the big question.
Yeah, at what point in our lives does this contextual scaffolding actually get built?
To understand the origins of that capacity, we really have to examine one of the most landmark studies in the history of developmental psychology.
Which one is that?
Emmy Werner and Ruth Smith's Kauai longitudinal study. The scope and the sheer dedication of this research are truly unprecedented in the field.
The logistics alone are mind-boggling to me. They started this way back in 1955, right?
Yes, 1955. They tracked approximately 700 children born that year, on the Hawaiian island of Kauai.
700 kids.
And they followed these individuals for over 4 decades, from birth through childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, and deep into middle age.
That's a massive commitment from the researchers.
It was. They collected medical records, conducted psychological evaluations, interviewed teachers, and spoke with the subjects repeatedly over the decades.
And the really crucial part of this massive cohort was a specific subgroup of those 700 kids, right?
Out of the total population, the researchers identified a group of roughly 200 children who were classified as high risk.
And when we say high risk, we are talking about severe compounding vulnerabilities.
Extremely severe.
These children were born into deep poverty. They experienced significant perinatal stress, meaning severe complications during the mother's pregnancy or the birth itself.
Right.
And they grew up in environments of profound family instability, which frequently involved parental alcoholism, severe mental illness, or chronic abuse.
From a statistical standpoint, those 200 children had the deck completely stacked against them.
I mean, they didn't stand a chance, statistically.
Every traditional sociological and psychological model of the era predicted catastrophic outcomes for them.
What were the experts expecting to see?
The expectation was that the vast majority would end up with high rates of criminality, chronic unemployment, severe mental health issues, and early mortality.
The prevailing thought was that trauma of that magnitude, that early in life, was essentially a life sentence.
Exactly.
But the findings contradicted everything the experts thought they knew.
They completely overturned the conventional wisdom.
When Werner and Smith looked at these high-risk individuals at age 18, and then again when they were in their 30s and 40s, they found something amazing.
What did they find?
Approximately 1/3 of them had developed into competent, caring, and confident adults.
Yes, the resilient 1/3.
They had steady jobs, stable relationships, they were contributing members of their communities, and they had no significant run-ins with the law or mental health systems.
And they achieved this without any formal, systemic psychiatric intervention by the state.
The emergence of that resilient 1/3 completely revolutionized how we view childhood development.
It forced the entire scientific community to ask, what separated those who thrived from those who succumbed to the statistical predictions?
Let me play devil's advocate here for a second, because I know what the cynical interpretation of this is.
Okay, let's hear it.
Did those 1/3 just win the genetic lottery? Were they simply born with a thicker skin, a better disposition, or a higher IQ? Because if it's just genetics, then the whole concept of building resilience is pointless. We might as well just give up.
It's a fair question, and temperament does play a role, but it is deeply nuanced.
Okay, so it's not just genetics.
No.
Mm.
Werner and Smith did find that some of these resilient children had what the researchers categorized as an easy, engaging disposition from infancy.
So they were basically the babies who were easier to soothe, who smiled readily, and who were naturally attentive.
Right. The babies who make eye contact and babble at everyone in the grocery store.
I love those babies.
We all do.
Mm.
And that's exactly the point. The smile itself isn't a magical shield against trauma.
Right.
That disposition matters because it acts as a catalyst in the environment. An engaging baby naturally elicits positive, attentive responses from caregivers and from other adults.
It draws people in and encourages interaction.
Exactly. However, and this is the absolute crux of the entire 40-year study, temperament alone is completely insufficient.
It's not enough on its own.
Not at all. The most powerful, essential, non-negotiable protective factors are relational.
It's entirely about the connections between people.
Yes. The research consistently points to what we call the one adult rule.
The one adult rule. I love that.
The single most common factor among these resilient, high-risk children was a secure attachment to at least one competent, caring adult.
And in these chaotic, high-risk environments we're talking about, that adult was very rarely the biological parent, right?
Unfortunately, yes. The parents were often too overwhelmed by their own severe struggles with addiction or poverty to provide that stability.
So who was stepping in?
So that one adult was frequently a grandmother, an older sibling, a dedicated school teacher, a sports coach, or even just a really attentive neighbor.
It literally just takes one person to alter the trajectory of a human life. That is so powerful.
We use the concept of scaffolding in developmental psychology to explain this mechanism.
Like construction scaffolding.
Exactly. If you picture the physical scaffolding erected around a building under construction, its purpose isn't to hold the building up forever.
Right. It comes down eventually.
It provides the necessary external support, structure, and safety so that the permanent internal load-bearing walls can be built.
Oh, I see.
A caring adult provides psychological scaffolding by providing a predictably safe environment, validating the child's emotional experiences, and modeling healthy ways to handle stress.
That adult creates the space for the child to develop their own internal self-regulatory and problem-solving capacities.
Exactly. They build the internal walls.
But wait, how does this one adult scaffolding concept hold up today?
What do you mean?
Well, I look at modern realities where parents are working 3-gig economy jobs just to make rent, right? Extended families are geographically fractured,
That's very true.
and community centers or after-school programs are constantly getting defunded. Are we setting kids up to fail by requiring a level of community support that our current economic system has essentially dismantled?
That is a profound structural critique, and the data absolutely supports your concern.
It does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Werner and Smith identified a third major protective factor, the presence of supportive community structures.
So it wasn't just individual one-on-one relationships.
No, it was institutional ones, too. Schools that offered engaging, well-funded extracurricular activities, community groups, and neighborhood organizations provided crucial external support.
They gave the children a role, a sense of belonging, and a purpose outside of their chaotic homes.
Precisely. And when we defund those structures today, we are systematically removing the scaffolding that makes resilience possible.
Which completely destroys the lone wolf myth of resilience.
Simply.
The resilient child is not born invulnerable. They are built. They are built by a supportive relational and structural environment.
You can't just mandate toughness.
Right. If you want to build a resilient kid, you don't send them to a grueling boot camp to toughen them up. You ensure they have a caring adult and a connected, well-resourced community.
You have to cultivate a supportive ecosystem. You cannot expect a seed to thrive in toxic soil just by screaming at it to try harder.
Okay, we've talked about the psychology and the sociology, but here's where it gets really interesting.
Oh,
I want to look at the literal physical brain wiring.
let's do it.
Because everything we just discussed about scaffolding and supportive relationships actually translates into biological changes inside the head. What does the brain actually do when it encounters adversity?
Neuroscience provides a fascinating validation of the developmental psychology we just discussed.
How so?
When we examine how the brain manages stress, fear, and trauma, we are primarily looking at the complex interactions within a triad of neural systems.
Okay, a triad. I like to think of this as the cast of characters inside our heads.
I love that. So the first major player in this cast is the prefrontal cortex.
And where is that, roughly?
This is the highly evolved, forwardmost part of your brain right behind your forehead.
Okay.
It is responsible for complex decision-making, logical analysis, understanding consequences, and, crucially for our discussion, emotion regulation.
Okay, so player one is the prefrontal cortex. Who's player two?
The second player is the hippocampus.
I always thought the hippocampus was just for memory.
We often do think of it purely as the memory center, but its role in resilience is largely about contextual learning.
And textual learning.
Yeah, it helps you understand the specific parameters of a memory, where it happened, when it happened, and under what specific conditions.
Okay. And the third player is the one that gets all the bad press, right?
The amygdala, yes.
The famous amygdala.
This is an ancient almond-shaped structure deep within the brain's temporal lobe. It acts as your primal threat responder.
The panic button.
Essentially, yes. It is the engine of your fear and survival reactions, rapidly processing potential danger before your conscious mind even realizes what's happening.
Let me try an analogy here, because neuroanatomy can get dense for people.
Please do.
I visualize the amygdala as an incredibly loud, overly sensitive fire alarm in a large office building.
Okay, a sensitive fire alarm.
It doesn't possess the nuance to care if there is a raging inferno on the third floor, or if someone simply burned their toast in the break room microwave.
Right, it doesn't know the difference.
Its only job, its absolute biological imperative, is to scream, "Danger! Everyone freak out and evacuate."
Yes.
And the prefrontal cortex is like the calm, highly experienced building manager.
I see where this is going.
When the alarm goes off, the manager walks into the room, assesses the environment, looks at the burnt toast and says, okay, alarm, you can turn off now. It's just toast. We don't need to call the fire department.
That analogy perfectly captures the dynamic. Yes, the constant communication between the fire alarm and the building manager is the core mechanism of how we process daily stress.
Okay, so how does this relate to resilience specifically?
To understand resilience, we have to look at what happens in resilient brains compared to individuals who develop trauma disorders, like post-traumatic stress disorder, following similar traumatic exposures.
Because if two soldiers experience the exact same combat event, or two people are in the exact same severe car crash,
Right.
and one develops PTSD while the other exhibits resilience, their physical brains must be managing that incoming data differently.
Functional neuroimaging shows us exactly that.
What does the imaging show?
In resilient individuals, we observe significantly greater prefrontal modulation of the amygdala.
So, to use the analogy, the resilient brain has a very strong, highly effective building manager who can quickly and efficiently quiet the fire alarm once the actual immediate danger has passed.
Yes, the connection between those two brain regions is robust and incredibly fast.
And in a traumatized brain,
In a traumatized brain, the manager is either asleep or just doesn't have a loud enough megaphone to cut through the noise of the alarm.
that makes so much sense. But where does the hippocampus fit in? The contextual memory part.
Furthermore, the resilient brain relies heavily on a highly functional hippocampus, which leads to a crucial phenomenon known as fear discrimination.
Fear discrimination, meaning the brain has a precise ability to tell the difference between a genuine threat and something that merely resembles the threat.
Exactly. Let's stick with the car crash example.
Okay.
If a person who developed PTSD from a severe accident hears screeching tires while watching a television show,
Their amygdala instantly sounds that massive survival alarm as if they are physically back in the vehicle.
right, the context is entirely lost. Their brain generalizes the fear response to completely safe environments.
Wow.
A resilient brain, however, utilizes the hippocampus to instantly provide context.
So it says, yes, the sound of screeching tires is associated with our trauma, but analyze the current environment.
Yes, we are sitting on a soft couch in our living room looking at a screen. The brain discriminates between the memory of the threat and the safety of the current context.
And that discrimination is what allows the body to physically calm down. It stops the physical stress response.
It allows for the adaptive regulation of the HPA axis,
Remind me, what's the HPA axis?
the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is the neuroendocrine system that controls your body's physical reaction to stress, pumping out cortisol and adrenaline.
Okay, the stress hormones.
The resilient brain activates that system when a fight or flight response is genuinely needed, but just as importantly, it efficiently downregulates and turns off that system when the threat resolves.
Which prevents that chronic corrosive wear and tear on the body's organs and immune system.
Exactly.
But let's connect this biological reality back to the kids in Kauai and the concept of early scaffolding we talked about earlier.
We absolutely should.
Because these physical neural differences, right? The strong building manager, the precise contextual memory, those aren't just genetic inheritances.
Not at all. They are heavily shaped by experience. These neural capacities reflect the continuous interaction of our genetic predisposition with our early developmental environment.
So it's nature and nurture interacting.
The echoes of our childhood are literal and physical in the architecture of the brain. The quality of our early attachment relationships, that one adult providing scaffolding we discussed, actually guides the physical development of these stress regulatory circuits.
So having a safe, responsive adult who co-regulates with you when you are a toddler literally wires your prefrontal cortex to be a more effective building manager 30 years later.
When a caregiver consistently soothes a distressed infant, they are essentially lending the baby their fully developed prefrontal cortex.
Lending their brain, I love that.
This repeated experience of moving from distress to calm helps physically wire the baby's own developing neural pathways.
But what happens when that adult isn't there?
Conversely, we have to look at the devastating effects of early adversity. In previous discussions on addiction, we explored adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs.
Right, things like profound neglect, chronic abuse, or witnessing domestic violence.
When a child goes through those experiences without the protective buffer of a caring adult, the stress isn't just an emotional hardship, it becomes physically toxic.
Toxic stress.
Toxic stress bathes the developing brain in chronic high levels of cortisol. And over time, that continuous flood of stress hormones can actually degrade the physical structure of the brain.
It actually damages the brain.
Yes. It can cause dendritic retraction in the hippocampus, physically shrinking the memory center and impairing contextual learning.
Oh my God.
And it weakens the vital neural pathways connecting the prefrontal cortex to the amygdala.
So the fire alarm gets permanently louder and more sensitive, the building manager gets fundamentally weaker, and the contextual memory gets blurry?
Yes.
The very hardware needed for resilience is damaged.
Early, unbuffered adversity leaves lasting neurological consequences that can permanently reduce an individual's future baseline capacity for stress regulation.
Which makes the way we talk about resilience in pop culture so infuriating.
It really does.
Because when society looks at an adult who experienced severe childhood trauma or who is currently living under the chronic toxic stress of poverty and demands that they just be resilient and push through a crisis with a positive attitude.
They are essentially demanding that a person run a marathon on a broken leg.
Yes, the biological infrastructure required for the task has been compromised.
The rhetoric of just toughen up isn't just insensitive, it's profoundly scientifically ignorant. It blames people for lacking a biological capacity that their environment completely stripped away from them.
This understanding of how the brain manages stress naturally brings us to the aftermath of massive, overwhelming trauma.
What happens next?
Because there is a concept that gets thrown around constantly in pop psychology that I think causes a lot of confusion, and that is post-traumatic growth.
Post-traumatic growth, or PTG. This is a very real psychological phenomenon.
Where did this come?
It was formally conceptualized in 1995 by researchers Richard Tedeschi and Lawrence Calhoun at the University of North Carolina.
And who are they studying?
They were studying populations that had faced highly challenging life circumstances, bereavement, severe medical diagnoses, combat veterans, and they consistently documented a profound psychological shift.
They found that across various types of trauma, a significant subset of individuals reported genuine positive psychological changes following their adversity, didn't they?
Yes, they weren't just returning to baseline. They reported developing new capacities, deeper perspectives, and shifted values that they flat out did not possess prior to the trauma.
And Tedeschi and Calhoun mapped this growth across 5 core areas, right?
They identified 5 specific domains of growth.
Walk us through them.
First, individuals reported an increased sense of personal strength, a realization that if they survived this horrific thing, they could handle anything.
Okay, strength is one.
Second, a greater openness to new possibilities, often resulting in dramatic life or career changes.
Like quitting a corporate job to teach.
Exactly. Third, deeper, more authentic relating to others, often involving increased compassion. Fourth, a profound daily appreciation for life itself. And fifth, significant spiritual or existential changes, a deepening of their belief systems or philosophy.
Let's weave those abstract domains into concrete reality for a second, because for some people, this is their actual lived experience.
Give me some examples.
We are talking about the bereaved parent who channels the unimaginable daily agony of losing a child into becoming a fierce, tireless advocate for safety legislation.
Yes, finding a completely new purpose in protecting others.
Right. Or we're talking about the patient who survives a brutal cancer treatment, and suddenly all the mundane office politics they used to stress over seem laughable.
Their priorities become crystal clear, and they invest entirely in their family.
Exactly. Or the refugee who is forced to flee their homeland, losing all their material possessions, but who manages to forge a richer, more interconnected, and deeply compassionate community in their new country.
Those scenarios are accurate representations of the profound shifts Tedeschi and Calhoun observed in their clinical work.
But I have to bring up a major concern here, because when you list those positive outcomes, it sounds dangerously close to that awful cliche, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
It does sound like that.
Are we sitting here validating the idea that trauma is actually a good thing? Because that feels like the ultimate form of toxic positivity.
This raises an important question, and it is vital that we make this distinction, because popular culture falls into this exact trap when it co-opts the idea of post-traumatic growth.
It's so problematic.
The concept has become highly problematic because of how aggressively it has been misinterpreted.
Society takes the finding that some people experience growth and twists it to imply that the trauma itself was a necessary beneficial gift.
Which is horrific.
It creates this narrative where victims are aggressively pressured to find the silver lining in their suffering. Or worse, it implies that if a survivor doesn't emerge from a tragedy stronger, wiser, and more enlightened, they have somehow failed at recovering.
Adding a burden of psychological failure on top of profound victimization is incredibly damaging.
It's cruel.
Tedeschi and Calhoun have spent decades trying to clarify this exact misunderstanding.
What do they actually say?
They stress, unequivocally, that the growth does not come from the trauma itself. Trauma is not beneficial.
They do.
Trauma is inherently destructive, chaotic, and harmful. The growth comes entirely from the individual's desperate, agonizing struggle to process the new, unwanted reality in the aftermath of the event.
The car crash doesn't make your muscles stronger. The crash breaks your bones.
Right.
The grueling, painful months of physical therapy and the exhausting psychological work you do after the crash is what builds the new muscle.
To understand how that new psychological muscle is built, we have to look at the mechanism of the assumptive world.
The assumptive world. I've heard this term.
This is a foundational concept in trauma psychology, heavily developed by researcher Ronnie Janoff-Bullman.
What exactly is our assumptive world? Give me an everyday example.
From infancy, you build a mental framework that allows you to operate in a highly complex, potentially dangerous universe without suffering constant panic attacks.
Because if you thought about all the dangers all the time, you'd never leave the house.
Exactly. You operate on a set of foundational, deeply held, usually unspoken beliefs. You assume that the world is generally safe and benevolent.
Right.
You assume that events are relatively meaningful and predictable. You assume that you are a competent, worthy person.
Those assumptions just run in the background.
When you wake up, you assume your house won't collapse. When you drop your kids at school, you assume they'll be there at 3 p.m. You assume that if you follow the rules, bad things won't happen to you.
That is your assumptive world. It's like the mental operating system that runs in the background so we can function.
And a massive trauma is, by definition, an event that completely contradicts and obliterates that operating system.
Because suddenly, the world is distinctly unsafe.
Life is entirely unpredictable. Good behavior does not protect you. Your mental map of reality is burned to the ground.
The cognitive dissonance must be staggering. So where does the growth actually happen then?
The growth is the effortful, intensely painful cognitive reconstruction of a new world model.
You have to build a new map.
The survivor has to sift through the ashes of their old beliefs and build a new framework that can acknowledge the horrific reality of the trauma, but still allow them to find a reason to keep living.
How do they do that?
They have to integrate the paradox. The world is profoundly dangerous. Bad things happen randomly to good people. And yet I can still find moments of deep joy. I can still trust certain people, and my life still has value.
It's an upgrade to the operating system, but the installation process is agonizing.
And we must be crystal clear about two fundamental realities of this process.
What are they?
First, post-traumatic growth coexists with severe distress. It does not replace the pain.
Pain doesn't go away.
The parent advocating for safety legislation still drops to their knees in grief over the loss of their child. The growth and the agony live side by side.
And the second reality.
Second, post-traumatic growth is not a universal experience. It is highly dependent on external support and resources, and it should never, ever be demanded or expected of someone who is suffering.
We cannot use the psychological concept of growth as an excuse to gloss over the structural horrors that cause trauma.
We absolutely cannot.
Which brings me to a massive shift in how we apply this science. Because glossing over structural problems by demanding individual psychological strength is essentially the core business model of modern corporate culture.
Oh, this is a fascinating transition.
Let's talk about the workplace. How does the science of trauma recovery compare to how massive companies treat employee stress and burnout?
The comparison is jarring, primarily because the corporate world has largely ignored the science of organizational behavior while simultaneously weaponizing the language of individual psychology.
Because a multinational corporation or a hospital system isn't just one big person with a prefrontal cortex. It's a complex network.
Organizations are not simply aggregates of individuals. We actually have excellent, deeply researched models of what resilience looks like at a systemic institutional level.
Where does that research come from?
If we look at the seminal research of organizational psychologists Carl White and Kathleen Sutcliffe, they study what are known as high-reliability organizations, or HROs.
High-reliability organizations. What defines an HRO? Like, give me an example of the kind of environment we're talking about here.
These are organizations that operate continuously in incredibly high-hazard, hyper-complex, unforgiving environments, but they manage to maintain remarkably low rates of catastrophic failure.
So not a typical accounting firm.
Right, definitely not. We are talking about air traffic control centers managing thousands of flights.
Oh, okay, high stakes.
Or the flight deck of a nuclear aircraft carrier right in the middle of a storm. Or a massive metropolitan emergency room.
Environments where if the system fails, people die immediately.
Exactly. They have to be structurally resilient.
So what makes an aircraft carrier so successful at avoiding disaster compared to a typical corporate office?
Week and Sutcliffe mapped out 5 institutional traits.
Let's walk through them, not just as a list, but as a culture. How do they handle failure, for instance?
Well, in a typical corporation, failures are hidden, minimized, or blamed on a low-level scapegoat to protect the stock price.
Right. Sweep it under the rug.
But HROs exhibit a chronic preoccupation with failure. Instead of celebrating when things go right, they actively hunt for near misses.
What does that look like?
If a nurse catches a medication error right before it happens, they don't bury it out of fear of getting fired, they dissect it. They treat every small anomaly as a symptom of a larger system flaw.
That's trait 1. What else?
They also exhibit a profound reluctance to simplify. They embrace complex, messy realities.
Instead of just using buzzwords.
Exactly. They don't force complicated operational problems into reassuring one-sentence PowerPoint bullet points just to make upper management feel in control.
I can think of a dozen corporate disasters that happened exactly because executives wanted a simplified narrative. And how does leadership operate in an HRO?
They maintain an intense sensitivity to operations. The leaders making strategic decisions are deeply connected to the situational reality of the front lines.
They don't just stare at financial spreadsheets in a corner office.
No, they intimately understand the daily friction and realities faced by the workers executing the tasks.
And trait 4.
Furthermore, they build a systemic commitment to resilience. They don't optimize the system to run at 100% capacity under perfect conditions.
Oh, this is huge for corporate burnout. They don't run a skeleton crew.
Right. They intentionally build slack, redundancy, and extra resources into the system so it can absorb sudden shocks and chaos.
And when the crisis actually hits, who makes the call?
That is perhaps the most radical trait: deference to expertise.
Meaning what?
In a crisis, the rigid corporate hierarchy dissolves. Decision-making authority immediately migrates to the person with the most relevant operational knowledge, regardless of their rank, pay grade, or formal title.
Wow.
If the lowest-ranking technician knows how to fix the failing valve, the admiral listens to the technician.
It is stunning to contrast those structural traits with a typical corporate resilience workshop.
Oh, it's night and day.
When I think of corporate resilience today, I picture an HR memo telling everyone to bring their whole selves to work, right? Followed by a mandatory Zoom seminar on deep breathing and desk yoga.
While the company simultaneously lays off 15% of the staff and demands the remaining workers absorb the workload.
Exactly.
Your cynicism is entirely validated by the leading minds in organizational psychology. Researchers like Arlie Hochschild and Amy Edmondson have offered scathing, empirical critiques of this exact corporate framing.
What is the fundamental flaw they point out?
The fundamental flaw is a sleight of hand. Organizations are deliberately treating systemic failures as individual psychological deficits.
They are shifting the blame.
Completely.
Imagine a massive hospital system facing a severe nursing shortage, high turnover, and rampant burnout. The root causes are chronic understaffing, forced overtime, and a toxic management culture that prioritizes profit margins over patient safety.
When that hospital administration responds to the crisis by offering the nurses a subscription to a meditation app or an hour-long workshop on building grit, they are committing a form of institutional gaslighting.
Yes.
Gaslighting, they are completely ignoring the terrible working conditions and unfairly burdening the individual employee with a psychological responsibility of surviving structural systemic failures.
It's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound caused by a faulty machine and then reprimanding the worker for bleeding too much instead of fixing the machine. It's maddening.
It is deeply unethical.
So if corporate desk yoga and generic motivational seminars are largely missing the mark when the structure is broken, what actually works for individuals?
When we strip away the commercial buzzwords, what are the evidence-based pillars of individual and community resilience?
Yeah, we need a serious reality check on our expectations here. True. Evidence-based interventions are much more modest than the multi-million-dollar self-help market claims, right?
There is no secret neurohack, but the research points to 4 interlocking domains that actually provide a buffer.
Let's weave these domains into a real-life scenario. Think about that overworked nurse we just mentioned, who is trying to survive a brutal schedule. Where does their actual resilience come from?
It starts at the absolute biological baseline, physical health.
Which sounds pedestrian, but it is scientifically non-negotiable.
We discussed earlier how a sleep-deprived, malnourished body has a biologically degraded capacity to regulate stress.
Right, the brain wiring.
If our nurse is sleeping 4 hours a night and eating out of vending machines, their prefrontal cortex is offline. The building manager is asleep.
You cannot outthink physiological exhaustion.
You really can't. Sleep is a primary resilience strategy.
So getting adequate rest provides the biological foundation. What does that foundation allow the nurse to do psychologically?
It provides the energy required for the second domain, cognitive flexibility.
Cognitive flexibility. Define that for us.
This is the capacity to approach adversity with multiple possible interpretations and responses, rather than relying on fixed, catastrophic, knee-jerk reactions.
It's the ability to pause and reframe.
When a doctor snaps at the nurse, cognitive flexibility allows the nurse to think, the doctor is incredibly stressed and communicating poorly, rather than the habitual response, I am terrible at my job and everyone hates me.
This is where evidence-based therapies like cognitive behavioral therapy actually shine by helping people revise those rigid interpretive patterns.
Absolutely.
And then crucially, how does this individual psychology connect to the people around them?
That brings us to the most reliably protective factor across all psychological literature. Social connection.
The one adult rule, but for grown-ups.
Supporting the maintenance of close, trusted relationships is infinitely more effective than any solitary psychological skill.
How so?
When our nurse debriefs the horrific shift with a trusted colleague who validates their experience, it literally buffers the physiological impact.
We can actually measure that.
We can measure this in a lab. Facing a threat alongside a friend lowers your heart rate and reduces your cortisol response compared to facing it alone.
Wow.
You cannot solo cope your way out of trauma.
And the final piece of the puzzle zooms out even further, right? Because the nurse's ability to sleep, afford therapy, and maintain friendships depends on the broader system.
Precisely. The institutional and community dimension is the one we neglect the most in Western dialogue.
What does true resilience require at that level?
True resilience requires structural safety nets, economic security, guaranteed health care, paid time off, and strong labor protection.
The boring bureaucratic stuff.
Exactly. Societies that feature lower income inequality and higher institutional trust demonstrate significantly higher collective resilience metrics.
It makes perfect sense.
It is infinitely easier to be psychologically resilient to a job loss. If you live in a society where losing your job doesn't mean you immediately lose your family's health care and face eviction.
Which is an incredible transition into looking at the global perspective. Because when you listen to the English-speaking Western models of resilience, even when we talk about relationships, it can feel very individualized.
The focus is almost always on the self.
Yeah, the focus is always, how do I get stronger? How do I optimize my coping skills?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the cross-cultural sociological literature provides a massive, necessary corrective to that hyper-individualized Western lens.
How do other cultures view it?
In many non-Western collectivist cultures, resilience is not viewed as a trait residing inside a single person. It is fundamentally and inherently a collective phenomenon.
Meaning the community is the organism that needs to survive, not just the individual cells.
The goal isn't about the individual recovering independently, achieving self-actualization, and going off on their own. It's about the community maintaining its function, its cultural meaning, and its relational cohesion in the face of immense adversity.
Look at indigenous resilience as a profound example of this. When we talk about communities that have faced centuries of severe collective trauma, violent colonization, intentional cultural erasure, forced assimilation, and ongoing systemic oppression. How does the concept of resilience function there?
In those contexts, recovery and resilience are absolutely not about sending individuals off to private one-on-one cognitive behavioral therapy sessions to reframe their thoughts.
That would just miss the point entirely.
True resilience requires the reclamation of collective practices. It is deeply tied to revitalizing lost languages, returning to traditional land-based practices, and rebuilding the specific spiritual and community structures that give the culture its identity and meaning.
Because the trauma wasn't just inflicted on a single person's psyche. It was intentionally inflicted on the entire cultural fabric.
Exactly.
So the healing, the resilience, has to occur at the level of the fabric.
Applying a purely individualistic Western psychiatric intervention without addressing the collective historical dimension of the trauma is often completely inadequate. and it can sometimes be counterproductive by further isolating the individual from their community context.
We see the sheer power of this collective approach when we study how communities recover from massive, sudden physical disruptions, don't we?
We do.
Think about the aftermath of a devastating natural disaster or a war zone. Sociologists study this. What predicts which towns will rebuild and thrive, and which ones will permanently collapse into ghost towns?
The strongest predictor of disaster recovery is not the total amount of emergency relief money poured into the area by the government.
Wait, it's not the money.
No, the most critical defining factor is social cohesion.
How do researchers even measure social cohesion in a disaster zone?
They measure the quality and density of community relationships prior to the disaster.
Okay.
They look at the strength of the community identity, the level of civic participation, and the degree of mutual trust among neighbors.
And what does the data show?
The data is incredibly stark. Communities with high social capital, where neighbors know each other's names, share resources, and have strong local networks, vastly out-recover communities that might possess significantly higher material wealth, but suffer from weak, fractured, isolated social bonds.
So a working-class neighborhood where everyone attends the same block parties, shares childcare, and looks out for each other will navigate the aftermath of a hurricane far better than a wealthy neighborhood of gated mansions where no one knows the person living next door.
Consistently, across global studies, the social bond is the ultimate shock absorber. The community is the resilience.
Let's bring all of these threads together because we've journeyed from the Latin engineering origins of a word to the microscopic neural firing of the amygdala, from the sugarcane plantations of Kauai to the flight decks of aircraft carriers, and through the profound differences between individual and collective healing.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Let's synthesize this by looking at the adjacent vocabulary we use in English, because the words a culture chooses to elevate reveal exactly what it expects from its citizens.
The lexicon of adversity response in modern English is incredibly crowded and heavily commercialized.
We have Angela Duckworth's massive concept of grit, which dominates education right now, focusing on relentless perseverance and passion for long-term goals.
Right.
We have the psychological concept of hardiness, implying a combination of deep commitment and an internal locus of control. We have the myth of bouncing back, and corporate metrics like the adversity quotient.
Each of those terms carries distinctly different philosophical implications about the nature of stress, and specifically, they dictate how much agency, control, and ultimate responsibility the individual is supposed to shoulder regardless of their environment.
Grit, for instance, heavily implies that if you just push hard enough, if you just refuse to quit, you will succeed.
Which, as we've learned from 40 years of developmental data, completely ignores whether or not that individual has the scaffolding, the one adult, or the neurological baseline to support that kind of push.
So when we strip it all away, what does this ultimately mean for you, the listener?
It means we have to develop a highly critical eye toward the dark side of how thoroughly positive the word resilience has become.
The dark side.
Yes, it has acquired a cultural halo effect. It is viewed as an unmitigated absolute good. But that relentless, unquestioning positivity actively stops us from asking the most critical sociological questions.
Which are?
Resilience to what and for whose benefit?
Oh, wow. Resilience to what and for whose benefit? That completely shatters the entire self-help frame.
It has to, because if you are training a child to be highly resilient solely so they can quietly endure an underfunded, crumbling, overcrowded school system without causing trouble.
Yeah.
Or if you're training an employee to be gritty and resilient so they can survive a highly exploitative, abusive workplace that extracts their labor without fair compensation.
You are actively weaponizing the language of psychology to obscure deep structural injustices.
You are demanding that the individual contort themselves, biologically and psychologically, to survive a toxic environment rather than demanding that the environment stop being toxic.
We are using a pseudoscientific concept to protect broken, exploitative systems from having to change. That is a profound realization. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We've dismantled a lot of damaging myths today, and hopefully we've given you a much clearer, scientifically grounded, and far more compassionate understanding of how humans actually survive the worst things in life. But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over as you navigate your week. We have thoroughly established that human survival and adaptation are fundamentally driven by supportive communities, by relational scaffolding, by systemic safety nets, and by deep social cohesion.
Yes, we have.
If that is the undeniable biological and sociological reality of our species, then perhaps our culture's frantic obsession with building tough, isolated, gritty, infinitely resilient individuals is actually a glaring symptom of a society that is fundamentally failing to take care of its people. Instead of obsessing over how to make ourselves tough enough to endure a bruising, exhausting, unsupported world, maybe our ultimate collective goal should be to build a world that requires a little less resilience in the first place.